This week on The Inside Story, U.S. military forces strike at Iran-backed militants in Iraq and Syria. Even as Secretary of State Antony Blinken is back in the region attempting to de-escalate the military tension. And with the war in Ukraine set to enter its third year, polling shows Ukrainian citizens remain resolute and determined to push back against Russian aggression. But in Washington, a bipartisan deal to fund border security, Israel and Ukraine seems likely to fail, torpedoed by the very people who wrote it, and drought-stricken California drenched by a river in the sky. Now, on The Inside Story, Strikes and Counterstrikes.
Welcome to The Inside Story. I'm Katherine Gypson in Washington. We start this week with the United States' response to an explosive drone strike in Jordan that killed 3 U.S. service members. U.S. officials say the attack came from a position held by fighters backed by Iran. In retaliation, the U.S. launched airstrikes in Iraq and Syria against some 85 targets linked to Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, reportedly killing about 40 people. VOA's Carla Babb leads off the show.
America retaliates. A late-night drone strike on a busy street in Baghdad Wednesday killed a commander for the Iranian-backed militant group Kataib Hezbollah. The U.S. military saying he was directly responsible for attacks against U.S. troops in the region. The retaliation began as B-1 bombers flew from the United States to hit 85 Iranian-backed militant targets in Iraq and Syria in response to the killing of 3 U.S. service members last week. The U.S. and the U.K. also struck 36 Iranian-backed Houthi targets in Yemen to stop them from firing on international shipping lanes. But Iranian proxies in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen did not appear to get the message. Iran-backed militants attacked U.S. and partner forces in Syria at least 2 times since Friday. An attack near mission support site Green Village killed 6 Syrian Democratic Force partners. The U.S. also destroyed more anti-ship missiles in Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen that were ready to launch into international shipping lanes after the U.S. and U.K. strikes.
We're not at war with the Houthis. We're not seeking to go to war with the Houthis. But if they continue the attacks, we will continue to disrupt and degrade their capabilities.
In addition to more attacks from Iran proxies, the U.S. is now taking heat from Iraqi officials who were not notified before the attacks, and who say civilians were killed during the U.S. strikes that occurred on their soil.
Iraq, like every country in the region, understood that there would be a response after the deaths of our soldiers. As for this specific response on Friday, there was not a pre-notification. We informed the Iraqis immediately after the strikes occurred.
To date, U.S. forces have been attacked about 170 times in Iraq, Syria, and Jordan since mid-October, while the Houthis in Yemen have attacked international shipping lanes in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden more than 30 times. Reporting at the Pentagon, I'm Carla Babb, VOA News.
Amid strikes and counterstrikes, the subject of the Israel-Hamas war looms large. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is visiting Egypt and Qatar Tuesday for talks focused on winning the release of hostages held by the militant group and on security and governance of a post-war Gaza. VOA's senior diplomatic correspondent Cindy Sain reports from the State Department.
Wednesday marked 4 months since the October 7th cross-border attacks by Hamas that killed 1,200 people in Israel and saw the U.S.-designated terrorist group taking some 240 people hostage. About 135 hostages are still unaccounted for. Ceremonies were held in cities around the world, including Paris. The top U.S. diplomat, Antony Blinken, is in the Middle East to push for the release of the hostages, including 6 Americans, and an extended pause in the fighting to get more humanitarian aid to Palestinian civilians in Gaza. But Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu dismissed a proposal by Hamas, which reportedly called for the withdrawal of all Israeli forces from Gaza.
Today, I told Secretary of State Blinken that after defeating Hamas, we will make sure that Gaza be demilitarized for good. The history already proved that there is only one force that can promise such a thing: the State of Israel, through the IDF and our security forces.
At a separate press conference late Wednesday, Blinken had this to say about the Hamas counteroffer.
While there are some clear non-starters in Hamas's response, we do think it creates space for agreement to be reached. And we will work at that relentlessly until we get there.
In Tel Aviv, a group of freed Israeli hostages appealed to Netanyahu to push for a hostage deal.
Again, I am turning to you, Mr. Netanyahu. Everything is in your hands. You are the one that can. And I am very scared, very afraid, that if you continue in this line of bringing down Hamas, there won't be any hostages to free anymore.
In his talks with Israeli officials, Blinken said that the death toll of Palestinians in Gaza is still far too high, and that any military operation against Hamas needs to put the safety of civilians first and foremost. According to the Hamas-run Ministry of Health in Gaza, at least 27,478 Palestinians have been killed in the Gaza Strip since October the 7th. About 70% of those killed are reported to be women and children. More than 66,800 Palestinians have reportedly been injured. Blinken also held talks in Ramallah in the West Bank with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. Blinken will hold more talks in Israel on Thursday and plans to meet with the families of hostages held by Hamas. Cindy Sain, VOA News, the State Department.
After months of negotiations, U.S. senators will vote on a $118 billion bipartisan agreement on border security and aid to Ukraine and Israel later this week. Even if the bill passes the Democratic majority U.S. Senate, it has little chance of passage in the Republican majority U.S. House of Representatives, as newly elected Speaker Mike Johnson says the bill is, quote, dead on arrival. $60 billion in aid to Ukraine and $14 billion in aid to Israel, part of a new $95 billion foreign assistance package now under consideration in the U.S. Senate, after Senate Republicans blocked a larger $118 billion bipartisan agreement on border security.
We knew about a week ago when Trump mixed in and said, wanted to be political and said he'd prefer chaos at the border because he thinks it helps him electorally. We knew that we might have to have a second option.
The bipartisan agreement would have increased immigration detention capacity, ended the practice of allowing migrants to remain in the United States while claiming asylum, and allowed presidents to temporarily shut down the U.S.-Mexico border if crossings reach certain levels. Conservative Senate Republicans said the bill didn't do enough.
This bill doesn't fix it. Understand, this border crisis is deliberate. Joe Biden caused it. He caused it by his own unilateral decisions.
But independent Senator Kyrsten Sinema, one of 3 senators who negotiated the agreement, said the opposition was a political calculation.
Less than 24 hours after we released the bill, my Republican colleagues changed their minds. Turns out they want all talk and no action. It turns out border security is not actually a risk to our national security. It's just a talking point for the election.
And Democrats warned the consequences of not passing aid to Ukraine would be far-reaching.
Republicans will be telling our allies Our word cannot be trusted. Telling dictators like Putin that our threats are not serious. Telling the world American leadership has been hollowed out by Republican obstructionism.
Earlier this week, Speaker Mike Johnson said the bipartisan agreement would be dead on arrival in the U.S. House. But House Republicans' standalone bill to send aid to Israel failed Tuesday night.
There is no reason whatsoever for them to object to the contents of that bill. They're doing it for political purposes. It's bad for national security.
Republican senators have asked to add border security amendments to the foreign assistance bill. Lawmakers are expected to work through the weekend to vote on passage of the aid package. After 2 years of a full-scale war, a survey shows Ukrainians are more united than ever in their rejection of Russian President Vladimir Putin and his ambitions for their country. But pride at their success in standing up to a much larger adversary is tempered by anxiety over future support from the international community. VOA's Eastern European Bureau Chief Miroslava Gangadze reports.
A decade ago, Ukrainians took to the street to protest their corrupt pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych. Despite facing a harsh crackdown, the revolution of dignity persisted, leading Yanukovych to flee to Russia. Soon after, Russia invaded eastern Ukraine and annexed Crimea. After years of a low-intensity war, on February 24, 2022, Putin started a full-scale invasion, aiming to conquer Ukraine within 3 days. However, Ukrainian forces resisted and, with international support, successfully reclaimed some initially captured territories. In his 2024 New Year address, President Volodymyr Zelensky told Ukrainians their nation has become stronger.
Ukraine has become stronger. Ukrainians have become stronger.
2 years after Russia's full-scale invasion, Ukrainians are unbowed. A new survey by the National Democratic Institute, a research organization funded by the US and other Western governments, finds 77% of Ukrainians are optimistic about their country's future and are doing what they can to help with the war effort. Those sentiments are evident among people VOA interviewed on the street of Kyiv.
My life changed a lot. Cardinally changed because I'm volunteering. I have a lot of friends in military, and I'm live in this war.
I have nothing to fear.
The strength shown by Ukrainians and the way they responded was unexpected by many, says Yevhen Hlibovitsky, head of the Frontier Institute, a policy think tank in Kyiv.
It's the people, it's the resilience that is in the people is what actually surprised the world. And I think this was one of the things that the West did not anticipate, was how determined Ukrainians would be, how resilient they would be, how strong they would be.
Yet today, as battlefield losses mount and the war settles into a punishing stalemate, Ukrainians are adopting a more realistic perspective on the war, says Marcin Walecki, Ukraine's country director at the National Democratic Institute, which conducts regular polls.
To realize that this would be a long war. In May 2022, majority of Ukrainians were thinking this is going to be up to 6 months. Right now, 43% believe the war will continue for at least another 12 months.
The survey suggests most Ukrainians strongly prioritize seeing their country become a more democratic. When asked by NDI how important it is to them that Ukraine become a functional democracy, 93% said it was important or very important.
A major challenge for the country when we ask about key institutions which have the highest level of trust when it comes to fighting corruption. On the first place, you have investigative journalists. On the second place, you have a civil society. So the spirit of revolution of dignity is still there. You know, Ukrainians would like to see journalists and civil society controlling political elite.
Before Russia's full-scale invasion, NDI's polls showed differences in public opinion on joining NATO between the more Russian-speaking regions to the south and east and the rest of Ukraine. 2 years later, almost 9 out of 10 respondents want to see their country join NATO, and support for EU membership is even higher.
Most of the Ukrainians realize that EU membership, NATO membership, this is going to be a long process. This is going to be a marathon, and they're getting their running shoes. They're prepared for that.
Nearly 90% of Ukrainians expresses worry over diminishing global backing for Ukraine. As Yevhen Glebovitsky sees it, the world must realize Ukraine is fighting to defend the very values that the West holds dear.
We hear the voices from the West that it's fatigued. That actually means that the Russians have scored a victory against the West in the West. And that is exactly the problem that Ukrainians have been yelling about, that look, the Russians see the weaknesses.
Ukrainians view reduced international support, corruption, internal divisions, and disinformation as top threats, second only to Russia's military aggression. Miroslava Gungadze, VOA News.
A reported split between President Volodymyr Zelensky and one of his top generals is raising concern inside Ukraine about the country's ability to fight Russian aggression, with some analysts calling it a political crisis. VOA's Anna Chernikova reports from Kyiv.
Victoria Nuland, Under-Secretary of State for Political Affairs of the United States, made another visit to Kyiv this month amid reports of an internal brewing rivalry in Ukraine. Nuland said her visit aimed to reassure Ukraine of Washington's continued support.
As hard as these days are, I will tell you that Ukraine is stronger and more resilient this winter than when I visited here last winter. We continue to provide security support in all categories, including new investments and new weapon systems.
Nuland's visit came at a tense moment inside the country, as a split between President Zelensky and his popular Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, Valery Zaluzhny, became public and difficult to hide. Zelensky has informed US officials he intends to replace Zaluzhny. Ukrainian analysts believe that the threat of internal destabilization is high, and Nuland's visit may indicate the allies are worried about it too. Vitaly Kulik is director of the Center for the Study of Civil Society Issues.
We can already say that Zaluzhny's removal from the post of commander-in-chief is inevitable. The removal of Zaluzhny, the disgrace, and everything connected with it now means that this is a political crisis.
Kulik says the crisis means Ukrainian political and military leadership will face challenges in meeting Ukraine's international commitments.
The West requires, first of all, certainty. Remove uncertainty, remove strategic confusion, provide certainty, and present a definite strategy.
Ukraine's brewing political crisis comes at a crucial time, as the country begins a third year of war against the full-scale Russian invasion. The battle is being increasingly defined by fatigue among both Ukraine's international supporters, who are talking about cutting aid, and here at home, as anxiety grows over a victory that is not coming fast enough. Anna Chernikova, VOA News, Kyiv.
Tensions are rising in Germany months before the European elections, following reports that members of the right-wing Alternative for Germany party discuss plans to forcibly transfer migrants, including German citizens. This has prompted tens of thousands of Germans to take to the streets and protest the rise of far-right extremism in their country. They say the allegations have uncomfortable similarities to Germany in the 1930s. However, polling shows support for the far-right AfD party is increasing. For more on this story, we hear from our European correspondent, Henry Ridgewell.
Outside the German parliament, some 150,000 protesters formed what they called a firewall against right-wing extremism Saturday. The target of their anger, the Alternative for Germany party, or AfD. Among the protesters were senior German politicians.
The AfD will never gain power in this country. We will all take a clear stand against it.
Nationwide protests have been held every weekend since mid-January, when the website Corrective revealed that AfD politicians had discussed the forcible transfer of migrants out of the country, even those with German citizenship, at a secret November meeting in Potsdam outside Berlin.
Neo-Nazis, donors, and AfD politicians spoke very specifically about the realization of the expulsion of millions of people from Germany. And this is a situation in which the AfD has a real option to gain power.
German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has welcomed the protests.
There is something in Germany which must never ever find a place again. It is the national race ideology of the Nazis. The repulsive relocation plans by these extremists is just that.
AfD co-leader Alice Weidel called the report a left-wing campaign.
The real enemies of the Constitution are those who call for a ban on parties.
Germany's painful history under Adolf Hitler and the Nazis makes the country acutely sensitive to right-wing extremism. There are growing calls to ban the AfD.
Forced transfer of people to other places sounds very familiar in a German context, and frankly, Germany cannot afford that. But in this case, the Article 21 of the German Constitution says that anything that will undermine or challenge the German democratic order is unconstitutional. There is then a process whereby the Ministry of the Interior will refer a particular party to the Supreme Court.
That would be a highly controversial step against the AfD, a party polling in second place at around 20%. With European and German state elections scheduled later this year, the political temperature is rising. Henry Ridgwell, VOA News.
Atmospheric rivers are nothing new to the U.S. West Coast. The region relies on them for up to 50% of its annual rainfall. But the problem, which is the world's problem as well, is that climate change is making them more common and more extreme. And that's what happened this week. From Oakland, California, Matt Dibble has more on this weather phenomenon that's dumped almost a year's worth of rain in less than 2 months.
The lives of millions of Californians are being disrupted by 2 powerful storms that have caused widespread flooding, mudslides, and power outages across the state. The second storm, which made landfall on Sunday morning, has parked over the Los Angeles area, where the California governor has declared a state of emergency for 8 counties. The storms are known as atmospheric rivers for the large volume of water they transport from the tropics and then rapidly release once they make landfall.
This is very rare and unusual and a strong signal of a very high risk of significant flash flooding.
Evacuation orders have been in effect in areas of Southern California most at risk for mudslides and flooding. In Northern and Central California, winds ranging from 60 to 125 kilometers per hour have downed trees and power lines, cutting electricity to nearly 1 million homes and businesses. The storm activity is expected to continue through Tuesday. Matt Dibble, VOA News, Oakland, California.
Thank you for being with us on The Inside Story. Stay up to date with all the latest news at voanews.com. You can follow me on X, formerly known as Twitter, @KJIP. Catch up on past episodes at our free streaming service, VOA+. For all of those behind the scenes who brought you today's show, I'm Katherine Gibson. We'll see you next week for The Inside Story.
In times of change, when the world seems uncertain, and what we hear doesn't reflect what we see, we seek the truth. When we are told only part of the story, we lose trust. At Voice of America, we bring you the stories that people take risks to see. we connect the world and unite it with truth. At Voice of America, we show you the whole picture.